on this webinar. But before we get into all of that, I would just like to ask both of you, maybe starting with you, Jordan, how was it in the lockup, and were there any surprises for you in the budget?
The big surprise was the lack of surprise. This is my 9th budget, and I overheard a journalist right at the very end saying something to the effect of that was boring, and it was. As often a contrarian in these sorts of lockups, where everyone's very excited about big spending ticket items, and I feel like I'm the only one whose heart sinks when you get that sort of thing. There wasn't any heart sinking today, because it was lots of oil for lots of little wee things, but there wasn't the big bang or the rabbit. And I mean, as I'm sure you guys did prior to going in, we do a lot of whiteboard sessions and what ifs in advance of the budget and ways we might be able to prepare. We had a laundry list of things we thought were possible, but then in the end, it was really nothing. The only big headline thing was the ECE, early childhood funding for 2-year-olds. That's a pretty small slice. It doesn't change the electoral dynamics, I don't think, for later this year.
So for Jordan, it was a big nothing budget. For you, Eric, was it a big nothing budget too?
Well, there are a couple of surprises in there. I had maintained this dark horse hope that somehow they would find room for a carbon dividend. We'd started hearing some kind of signals that there might be something in the works on that late last year. They seem to be leaving room for it. I wonder whether the failed ETS auction earlier this year made that a lot more difficult, where they might have otherwise wanted to say, hey, we're taking all the money that we're earning at ETS auction and we're going to give it back to households. Well, they didn't earn anything at the last ETS auction, and the projections on what they will be earning are lower than they would have otherwise been. It's disappointing in the sense that if you think the problems that the government ran into late last year were because the government's worried about rising carbon prices, they could still have left room saying, look, we don't have any ETS revenues in the last auction, but that means that they're not affecting cost of living very much, right? Carbon prices are low, they're not driving up household expenditures, but once we start earning money in this again, we could just rebate it back to households to deal with cost of living pressures if they come through. It would have given the government more room to let the ETS do its work. So that was a bit disappointing, but I could understand that. Well, people used to joke about chewing gum tax cuts. This would have been a nothing carbon rebate based on their not having any ETS revenues. So that was a minor disappointment a big disappointment in the grand picture, a minor one relative to expectations, because I downweighted expectations. They were going to go ahead with it because of those changes in the auctions. The slightly bigger surprise was that Connor English succeeded. So he's been pushing hard for massive subsidies to the video game sector, and well, they gave him what he wanted. So Australia has been subsidizing their video game industry, and you hear that their sector has been coming to New Zealand, trying to recruit staff here, trying to get business over across the Tasman, and it's a bit of a problem with this, right? So we've seen this with the film subsidy regime, where there's just no way out of it. Once you start providing the subsidy to the industry, it's self-reinforcing, and you can never stop giving them money. It's there forever. It's $160 million over the forecast period, but it is going to go up if Australia starts giving more money. It will go up if we start getting more business here. And remember that this isn't a net increase in economic activity in New Zealand. It's a shift in the composition of it. Some small part of business might have shifted to Oz, but the other sectors will fail to increase. And Oliver's looking nervous and getting into too much detail here.
Well, yeah, I was going to say congratulations to Connor English for effective lobbying. I'm sure he will probably win a prize from the Taxpayers Union for that, Jordan. But let's talk big picture. For me, it was a year-right budget. It was a year-right budget because you heard all sorts of heroic assumptions. So apparently inflation is on the way down to target range by next year. And actually economic growth looks good. The recession is off the cards. Everything is going to be fine. And on top of it, of course, tax revenues keep coming in. We'll have an increase actually in direct taxes, geometric average for the next 5 years of 8.3% per year. So this government is swimming in money and everything is rosy, right?
Well, they're swimming in deficits, so they've pushed out the return to surplus by a few years. At the half-year fiscal update, they were projecting a lot better accounts. Now they were projecting lower GDP growth, but they were expecting that we'd be taking on less debt. We did have the cyclone in between, but it's not just cyclone spending that's making up this difference. Bryce Wilkinson at our office had put together some numbers just looking back to comparing things against the fiscal plan that Labor had put in when they came into office in 2017. And compared to that, the budget and economic fiscal update for this year has per person $2,800, almost $2,900 in real expenditure per capita. So the government is spending on behalf of each and every one of us. The COVID response is over. They're spending almost $3,000 more per person than they had promised back in 2017. Now, you'd have expected that big increase over the COVID period, and we did see that. Makes sense, absolutely. Give them a pass for that. That's what government should be doing. We're in 2023. That's done, and we're still paying $2,877 more real per capita.
Jordan, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? The tax revenues are at a record high. We are still running deficits. Unemployment is at a record low. The economy is not going into a recession. None of this really fits together, does it?
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the difficulties is you're given, you're given sort of a core of about 200, 250 pages, and then if the estimates are probably a couple of thousand pages, and you've got sort of 3 hours to both read them and prepare your response and draft your comms, and then you come on to things like that, and you're expected to be an expert in it. There's a disconnect there. The economic picture painted by Treasury in this budget is significantly better in that we're no longer apparently going into recession than it was at the half-year fiscal update in December. And yet the position of the government is far worse. I think it's over the 4-year projection period, it's about a $20 billion gap between what at the end of last year they were saying what would be coming in and what would be going out. So there's a big hole there, and I want to get my head properly around that, which I pretend I yet do. The first page I went to, and I sat next to Eric, and of course the economists start on the end of the economic stuff, and we start on the end of the spending side. But as soon as I turn to the Treasury document, as opposed to the political one about what the politicians want you to focus on, is looking at debt projections, and it is alarmingly different as both the absolute figures, but as a percentage of GDP. And I always look at gross debt. This sudden trend post-COVID that we now must look at net debt, according to Grant Robinson. This is what Stephen Joyce was pointing out recently in the Herald, that we're now comparing apples and oranges. But there's something material has happened. What was it? 5 billion, wasn't it, Eric? Difference by 2027. Now,
I think it was 5% of GDP.
It was 5 percentage points.
Yeah, sorry, 5% of GDP. Yeah, sorry, apologies. Absolutely. For that to happen in 6 months, I really want to get my head around that and understand how much of that is simply that because we've got so much rolling over in the next 12 months, and with the cost of borrowing so much higher, how come that hadn't flown through in December?
Eric, do you have an answer to that question?
No, I'd have to look closer through the accounts as well. On Jordan's earlier point about inflation being on track, the Reserve Bank has to forecast that they will have inflation back on track, because if they don't project that they'll get inflation back within bounds over the medium term, and that is typically assumed to be about 2 years, they're forecasting that they have failed in what they're trying to do, right? So if that is their forecast, what they're supposed to do is ramp interest rates up more, redo the forecast, see if that gets you back on track. Now, what I'm a little bit curious about is whether the Reserve Bank was expecting that the government would be spending this much more relative to its tax take over the next few years. Because if it wasn't, then it will have to respond with higher interest rates than it otherwise would have been. Now, it could be that Adrian Orr was already expecting this, that he'd already baked this in on his forecast. I'd have to check back on some of their projections. But if this was unanticipated, then it will affect their track.
Well, I was actually wondering whether the government actually talks to the Reserve Bank anymore, because in the RBNZ's latest forecast, they didn't have inflation go down back to their target range, but the government now says it will.
Well, there's a difference here, though. This is Treasury's opinion versus the Reserve Bank's. That they are required to enact with some independence in relation to the forecast. This is the genius of the system we have, is that it's pretty clear what is political and what document is, which is why, frankly, we're so interested in it, is that we do put a lot of weight on what advice Treasury is giving and what when they kick the tires, why these projections matter and why these changes are so significant.
I guess they're expecting the Reserve Bank to do its job.
Well,
fingers crossed.
And since you just mentioned how political everything is, I was a bit surprised that we didn't get a hint of a wealth tax in the Minister of Finance's speech. You wouldn't have expected it in the government's budget, of course, because that was pretty much ruled out before. But after all the discussion of the last few weeks, really, after David Parker released his tax report, you would have expected at least some discussion of that in his speech in Parliament.
Well, they did about what I was at Minister Parker's talk in response to the IRD and Treasury work about a month ago on high net wealth individuals. I was expecting at the time that his cabinet colleagues apparently aren't all that keen on some of where he wants to go on wealth taxes, but it wasn't going to surprise me if they did something about the differential between the trust rate and the top marginal tax rate, because that was something that Minister Parker had pointed at, and that seemed at least feasible. It'll create other distortions that Jordan might want to talk about, but that didn't seem crazy as a response to that work. They have provided that now. It will affect higher net worth individuals, so you could see it as in that context. But I would expect that they would be saving anything like capital gains tax or wealth tax to match up with pre-election promises.
All right, guys, after this initial round, I think we should open it up to questions. And for that, I put us onto a trinity of speakers now, and I hope you can all see that. First question actually on Slido is, and I think we've kind of already answered it a bit, to what extent does the budget affect New Zealand's long-term debt position, and is it possible to estimate the opportunity cost of not focusing on more debt reduction? That was a question asked by Gordon. Jordan, do you want to have a crack at answering that?
Yeah, I want to tackle that because that I'm accused of being overly focused on debt. We like to talk about the debt monster here because, I mean, we're a taxpayer group, and frankly, debt is just a tax tomorrow. It's just a timing issue, which is why you have to focus at the spending, whether you're funding it with taxes or debt. But the commentariat that where our intelligentsia seem to believe, but look, as a percentage of GDP, we're better than everyone else. But of course, we're more vulnerable than everyone else because of the level of private borrowing we owe the rest of the world. And for me, the most significant figure that came out of today was that our debt servicing costs had just exploded, that they are now larger and predicted to be larger over the forecast period from here on in than law and order. We're spending more already, and while we continue to run deficits, on debt servicing than law and order. And I think that's quite significant in terms of, does that answer the question in terms of an opportunity cost?
And to put the figures into context, Jordan, I think we're talking about $22 million in debt servicing costs a day.
I'd need to check the official Taxpayers Union debt clock at debtclock.nz, which will be updated in the next 24 hours with these figures to work it out. But I'll take your word for it, Oliver.
We'll check that out on your website, Jordan. Eric, long-term debt financing.
Well, of course, the debt path is now higher than it had been projected back in December. We've already gone through that a bit, and that does have an opportunity cost. What I would be more focused on would be just value for spend, right? So if you were actually getting something really worthwhile out of it, maybe the debt is worth it. And it totally makes sense that you would want to raise more debt to deal with things like a big cyclone that nobody was expecting, right? Those sorts of things, well, you want to have a mix of debt and spending reallocations to deal with them. More debt to deal with that makes sense. But then you look at some of the other initiatives that they've picked up in there, like throwing money at the video game sector and putting them on the same path that the film sector has been on. You got to wonder.
Yeah, and it's not just that. And of course, we have to once again congratulate Connor English on his great victory. But it's hydrogen as well. And there was another question here on Slido. 32.5 million in hydrogen. Is the government trying to subsidize a whole industry into existence?
Yeah, it's winner picking, right?
They're proud of it.
And they're proud of it. But is 32.5 million even enough to subsidize an industry into existence?
I'd have to look at it a lot more closely than give something off the cuff. It feels like the kind of winner picking that we shouldn't be trying to do. I
suspect, John, that you would.
Trying to find there isn't. No, I'm just looking for the relevant press release, but that's okay because there wasn't a heck of a lot of detail on it. Just going back to the to Connor English's victory, though, I do think it speaks volumes, or we should reject any idea that this is through some living framework or compassion budget when the video game industry is getting more business support than the businesses in Hawke's Bay, which is a separate item in the same document. And I think that says it all.
Yeah, I guess one other last bit when we're thinking about the net debt track, I think that there's a cigarette burn in the accounts here. So the government is forecasting a return to surplus in 2025, 2026, and it's going to be about $600 million. They figure that they're going to be net to the good in that year. Now, if you've been paying attention, and I've been yelling about this for like non-tax reasons, but the government has put in place legislation that took effect on 1 January this year that will mean tobacco sales from April 2025 have to have really low nicotine content. And if you compare those rules to like the average nicotine content in a cigarette, it's like mandating that beer can't have more than 0.2% alcohol in it, okay? Now, you'd think that if that legislation is coming in, it might have some effect on tobacco excise revenue, right? Because the only way that this stuff has health benefits is if it reduces the number of cigarettes that people are smoking. And they've been touting the health benefits of this. If you look at Treasury's accounts, they're figuring that it's $1.7 billion in tobacco excise revenue basically forever. It's just like minor year-on-year decreases as people flip over to vaping, but there's no change in the numbers from 2025. If even a third of that revenue drops away when smokers say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not willing to pay $1.20 in excise for a cigarette that's got no nicotine in it, maybe they've got a cigarette burn in the accounts and there's no way we're going to get back to surplus in 2025, 2026. It's going to push it out a year.
Yeah.
So are you telling us that the government expects its own policies not to work?
Well, that is the inference from Treasury's projections. It's like Treasury saying, now this policy is going to do nothing. I don't think that's what happened. I think that they just haven't had a chance to run any numbers on it because they didn't get whatever background they needed from Ministry of Health on it early enough.
No,
but I would have at least...
That was a risk. That's been listed as a risk in the past. That the smoking
and it's not in the fiscal risk system.
Yeah.
But the difference between getting this right and getting this wrong means actually surplus or deficit.
Well, yeah, and it's huge, right? So like it's huge, and it is terrible that it's huge. The government gets about 1% of its total tax revenue out of smokers. Smokers are disproportionately really, really poor.
Right.
Yeah, so it's 1.7 billion, right? So run it across.
Okay.
And crown tax revenue.
We have a question here on the trust rate. The trust rate has now moved up to 39%. Is that compatible with the government's promise not to introduce any new taxes?
No, absolutely not. But the devil's in the detail. We don't know whether that flows through to, say, child beneficiaries. If you're distributing it down to beneficiaries, currently they pay the 33%. If they're then paying the 39%, then very clearly it is a tax increase. It was the only appearance we had from David Parker in the lockup was via a written press release on that matter. And that was the only link back to his Nosy Parker high net worth IRD research project. and that he would have you believe that this measure is about hitting those uber wealthy individuals and families. In actual fact, what it will incentivize is simply keeping money in companies as opposed to ever distributing them up to trustees. But who it is going to hit is actually mom and pop SME business owners who rely on those businesses to support their family. So we haven't yet seen the bill. It's presumably going to be out tonight. Obviously, IRD haven't done any sort of consultation on this. So I'm a little bit reluctant to get too much into it before we see any of the detail.
Okay.
But broken promise, absolutely.
Okay. I think we've talked about video games enough, probably, but there's still one question that I have to read out. It's so nice. Are video games businesses to Chris Hipkins what DJs were to Jacinda Ardern?
Or what Lord of the Rings was to prior governments, right?
Yeah.
DJ's
a cheater, Oliver.
Oh, sorry. All right. More serious question. Eric, do you agree with those commentators who see massive inflationary effects in this budget?
I wouldn't say massive, but relative to what we were expecting at the half-year fiscal update, it will be an additional pressure. If it's a pressure that the Reserve Bank had not anticipated, then it increases the interest rate track. If they had already expected that something like this would happen, then it's already in their forecast, and I wouldn't know.
And I see you nodding, Jordan.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary.
Cool. Another question for Eric, actually on ETS prices. Is that the reason why the government's been so slow on introducing a carbon capture regime?
That's a really good question. So just to step back to what the question's about, New Zealand has a remarkably clean ETS. It was designed, targeted at net emissions, and it was meant to not care whether the next ton of emissions failed to be emitted in the first place or was sucked out of the atmosphere, whether by a tree or by a piece of tech. Now, they hadn't come up with a framework yet for a piece of tech that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, but that tech keeps developing. Or carbon capture and storage is often now like the most viable form of it. If you're burning coal or burning gas at a facility, well, you collect the CO2 when it's emitted, or as much of it as you can. You find some way of securely storing it. And I've seen reasonable work suggesting that like old natural gas fields in Taranaki, you could pump carbon dioxide down there and it could last there for thousands of years without leaking out as long as you did the thing properly. We don't have a regulatory framework for recognizing that kind of capture and storage yet. We do have one around trees. So we've seen a lot of trees being planted and people get mad about there being too many trees. We don't have a framework yet for carbon capture and storage, and we really need one. Now, I don't think that it's revenue effects that have been driving that because it won't really affect, well, first off, the ETS revenues, the amount the government earns when it sells carbon credits, that's hypothecated into its own slush fund that Robertson uses for reduced fares on buses or industrial subsidies through JITI or other kinds of nonsense. The government overall doesn't get a whole pile of money otherwise out of it. I think it's more an ideological view that it's worse to allow storage because that lets us keep sinning, as opposed to stopping us from emitting in the first place. There has seemed a more theological turn in all of this lately that's pretty disappointing if the goal is net zero by 2050.
If I see this correctly, we have Laurie on the call. Is that right?
Yeah, sorry, I've just joined on audio because I'm having real trouble with the other link, with the internet link. So sorry to be coming on so late.
Well, even if we can't see you, it's great to have you on this call. What did you make of the budget, Laurie?
What did I make of the budget? Well, I thought it was a fairly middle-of-the-road budget for an election year overall. I mean, the real story here, and perhaps you've talked about this already, is the eye-watering levels of public debt that we're heading for. And this is obviously a great concern in the country, as we've just seen, which is we're not only the shaky Isles, we're a country that happens to be on the very edge of the tropical cyclone zone. So every couple of years we have an emergency of some kind, a climate emergency, in the Hackney's phrase, or a weather event that's extremely expensive, and for that reason, we need to preserve our headroom. And budgets such as this, which just advance astronomically the level of public debt, don't do that. So that was my largest and most immediate takeaway from that. Other than that, it's a bit of cash splurged here and a bit of cash splurged there, with a hope of obviously appeasing various interest groups in interest year, but in the election year, but nothing very surprising or nothing that's really going to change the structure of things. But the real story, I think, here is the debt story. But as I said, perhaps you've talked about that already.
A little bit, but from your perspective and from your experience, Laurie, what would be a prudent level of debt for a country like New Zealand?
Well, that's how long is a piece of string, isn't it? When we were around the 20 mark, that was comfortable, I would say, probably that kind of zone in the early 20s, maybe 30 at the outside, but at the moment we're edging into the mid 40s, and that's certainly way beyond where I'm comfortable. It just doesn't give us the financial resilience that we need to weather these shocks. The other point I would make in respect of debt is, if we look at the explosion of government spending in recent years that we're having to pay off, if you were to simplify that into sort of accountancy terms, you'd say we've been borrowing to fund the P&L rather than the balance sheet. So we haven't been really investing in productive capital. We haven't been building assets on the national balance sheet. We've been plugging gaps in expenses. And again, I look at this budget and I don't see anything different than what's proposed here. I don't see, it wouldn't probably happen under this government, but I don't see investment in the mining industry or expanding our ability to produce cheaper electricity. Those things are absent from this. And so, this is really the thing that I think needs to change. We need to move away from, this sort of approach to budgeting that stresses plugging these gaps in the expenses, and really to think about, what are we using our borrowing to build in terms of assets for the New Zealanders of today and the future. That kind of thinking just isn't here.
There are a couple of things, Laurie. One is that the government has actually changed the way it measures its debt. So that probably alone accounts for about 10% of GDP in the various measures. The other one is actually that the government's also defined that it regards 30% as prudent and no longer just 20. So combined, actually, the effect is probably in the order of about 20–30% of GDP when it comes to debt measurements.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. Yeah. I mean, these are worrying times. Sorry, carry on, Oliver.
If you had wanted to make a comparison, I've got the table in front of me right now. Net core crown debt as a fraction of GDP coming out of the GFC in 2013 was 25.5%. So after they dealt with everything from GFC, this is now I believe that this is on a consistent measure because they've got it across the same table, and Treasury wouldn't have different measures in different years. So it's got it on the same footing. So does 25.5% of GDP had gotten down by 2019 to just under 19%, but we're looking by 2027 that it's 37%, and it goes it's past 40 in 2024, comes back down by 2027, but we're still a good deal above where we were coming out of the GFC.
And that leads us straight to the top question actually from Slido, because the top question on Slido currently, it's the $100 billion question. What's the risk if Robertson's gamble doesn't come off, and if inflation doesn't fall and tax revenues don't hold up as interest rates rise? Then we are in trouble, aren't we?
Well, sure. And I'd have to check the figures from it, because Treasury does have some sensitivity analysis around this stuff, the effects of a change in interest rates, but I would have to dig those tables up.
Jordan.
Short-term inflation helps the government's books, but as your borrowing increases, naturally it becomes harder and harder. A lot of it is, and I think one of the things I've really learned as part of this budget process is the extent to which your debt timing matters. That we've having a lot of debt rolling over this financial year when the cost is high, and it bounces the figures around. Just in relation to, because I'm getting frustrated. I'm delighted that to Laurie since I got out of the budget, and it appears I've got at least the half right in relation to our comms. That's good. It's come to the same conclusion. But the this frustration about looking at the Grant Robertson wants us to look at net debt. It's gross debt and the increased decoupling that I think we should be considering and figuring out what it is. Because from a taxpayer's perspective, borrowing money for the sake of the super fund is real dangerous when your cost of borrowing is going so high.
Laurie.
Oh no, I was just supporting Jordan's point. It is really dangerous. I mean, and the other thing that's missing from this budget is, and perhaps it's in the detail which I haven't seen, but I look at some of these proposed expenditures, and I can't help but wonder what the cost-benefit analysis on some of them was. I mean, probably the most egregious example is the support proposed for the gaming sector.
Yeah, we did cover that. We did cover that, Laurie. A little bit.
Covered that. Well, maybe you can tell me. Is it value
Cool,
creating?
160 million.
Any analysis demonstrates that it's value creating?
Yeah. There's an additional actually in all of this as interest rates. Yeah, no, as interest rates increase, of course, what also increases is the bill we have to pay for the LSAP program, so the large-scale asset purchase program by the RBNZ, currently at about $10 billion and increasing if we don't get the interest rate under control, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's simple. Okay, $10 billion down the drain. Next question from Slido. Can you please give us an overview of where the government will be moving in on private sector areas and competing with private businesses? I'm not quite sure which one Raquel means in this question, but maybe you could try to answer her question nevertheless. Jordan?
Well, we didn't. Last budget, I think Stuart Nash accidentally started a bank. We didn't have any of that. A lot of corporate welfare, but nothing springs to mind that I've yet seen about government sort of moving into any particular industry. In fact, it's the first budget I can recall where there wasn't some big dollop of money for KiwiRail and that, you know, reinventing or retracking KiwiRail to put it on a sustainable path, which of course never ever happens.
And thank goodness we haven't got Kiwi March yet. All right. Next question from Paul RS. I have a feeling who that is. Education is a major priority for the initiative. There's some new money for early childhood education in classrooms, etc. Have you got any views on the quality of that spending versus where else it could go?
If I may, I suspect not high. I read this as a sort of babysitting subsidy. It might encourage some people back into paid employment, and so there's probably a benefit there. But as the questioner has so rightly observed, you know, whether this is a net beneficial thing for the country as a whole depends on what's going to be happening during those years of early childhood education, and that's where we're, as you know better than anyone at the initiative, actually, we're falling behind at the moment, and we don't have the stellar education system that we once had in I think the 1970s, where we were always amongst the top 10 in the world. The similar part of the same packages were what they proposed to do for schools, and so lots of money to build more classrooms, lots of money to build more equipment into schools, so investment in capacity, but a pay rise for teachers, and for what? I mean, are they overperforming at the moment? Can we give them a pay rise on that basis? The PISA results would seem to suggest otherwise. So I wasn't particularly enamored of this particular move into early childhood education, but I don't know how others feel. It all depends on what those kids are going to be using those hours doing.
But apart from the support for ECE, was there anything else in the budget actually on education? I mean, you had a chance to look through the budget documents in the lockup. Was there anything at all on education?
Not that hadn't already been in it, but look, as a father of a newborn and a 3-year-old, I think this is something I can get behind.
Yeah. Well, you can almost more money in education is going to do less good unless it's accompanied with structural reform. So if you had a package that coupled substantial reforms to the education system with more spending in education, you could do a lot of good, but that wouldn't really be a budget announcement. That would take a lot of policy work ahead of time. So it's almost, well, you would want teacher salaries not to be falling behind in real terms with inflation, but at least they're not going to be throwing a whole pile of money in without having gotten some of those reforms thought through. Not that I think that they're thinking through reforms, but throwing money at it without having made that a precursor to it or a prerequisite for it would have been a mistake.
All right.
And I think that's what was lacking in this budget, Oliver. Like when we first started and said there wasn't a rabbit, there wasn't really a theme either. Think about the way that budgets are, yep, they're about splurging cash and keeping everyone happy and appeasing the interest groups. But there's usually a narrative, and it's usually BS, but some sort of vision. There really wasn't here. There was just absolutely nothing. It was very clear there was minimal stuff on climate change. The Greens had been sidelined, but there wasn't really the bread and butter either. It really lacked that sort of narrative. Getting mentioned infrastructure, getting out of the way of or clearing regulatory burdens. There wasn't really that. There was a big fund around infrastructure, but the minister's speech didn't really make too much of that. It seems very, it's to say, it was a very strange budget.
I have to agree with you, John. I've already forgotten the headline of the budget document. Was it something like "Here today, gone tomorrow"?
Well, sure if only some of it were gone tomorrow. So the other thing to watch for is things that will continue beyond the projected period. So they've suggested that they're going to be continuing the school lunch program, and make of what you will of the merits of it. They've only got it projected through, I can't remember now whether it's the end of 2024 or the end of 2025. But if you were to have the same government again, the odds of them failing to continue it are about the same as the odds of the government failing to continue the petrol excise rebate a year ago, right? So it's spending that's almost...
Well, they did cancel that.
Well, I said a year ago.
That was another tax hike. Yeah. So, yes, of course.
Well, we can argue about that another time. But if it's something like that, that's almost certain to continue, it really ought to be included in the continued forecasts, because otherwise you're too rosy about what the net debt position is going to be at the end of 2027. If you've got these programs that Labor would almost certainly continue, but they've said, oh no, we're going to stop this at the end of 2025. Like, why believe that?
Okay. Quick question. Who is the best economist on this webinar? Is that you, Eric, or you, Laurie? I think you, Jordan, you're a lawyer, you don't count.
Oh, it's Eric. Of course it is.
Okay, Eric. In which case the question is for you, but you have to explain this in very simple terms to us here. Question is, economic theory says not to worry about a chronic current account deficit, but assume a can opener that it is important. What should be done to reduce this? Are you worried about the chronic current account deficit?
No, because we have a flexible exchange rate. So if you have a current account deficit means, well, you got capital account surpluses. And if it continues that way, well, the dollar has to depreciate. So we will. Well,
that would be a bit of a worry for many Kiwis, right?
Well, for those who buy things, it's bad. The price of imports will go up. We get some price pressure from imports that way. The value of things in New Zealand dollars that we export, that goes up. That's how it's meant to work. If you were really trying to address it.
So apart from the fact that the country is getting poorer, it's not a problem.
Well, our being poorer is a problem, but I wouldn't look at the current account deficit per se. I'd look more at, like, why is the government borrowing a whole pile of money for stuff that doesn't make sense? Like, that will be contributing to it. Care about it for those reasons on their own grounds rather than the effects on the current account deficit.
All right. Next question. How much of the 10.7 billion on total capital spend announced is new money rather than recycled money?
That's a question for an accountant, not me.
Yeah, that's always, because of course it's the numbers are always very hard. Some of them are over the forecast period, some of them are per year, and then you've got the capital versus OPEX, and it just takes a bit of time to step back and work through.
Right. What are they forecasting for revenue from the ETS? And does this give us an indication on their commitment to the ETS as the main tool to reduce gross emissions?
The revenue forecasts from the ETS are down substantially. So you lose about a third of the revenues that you might have otherwise been expecting. They're showing a decline in ETS revenues over the forecast period. Now, you would expect that over the longer term, because as you get towards net zero, the government is going to be auctioning off fewer credits. And if you're doing everything right, revenues from the ETS go up for a while. I'll do it this way because it's mirrored. Revenues from the ETS go up for a while as the price effects dominate, but then eventually the reduction in the quantity that's auctioned dominates, and then when you're at net zero, you get zero money from it, right? Because you're not auctioning off credits anymore, even if the carbon price is high. That effect's coming through a lot faster, and it's presumably Treasury's forecast on the carbon price that's based on the current futures prices and the current price, which are affected by the government's policy decisions back in December.
Or
I
has
think,
it something to do
I think
with?
they used 31 March, Eric. I
sorry?
came across that. I think they just used a fixed point of 31 March. I don't, maybe I misread it.
Well, it's because of all the complementary measures that they're
yeah.
undertaking to take emissions out of the system.
No, that's not going to be it.
Right.
No.
All right. Next question. Greens talk about excess profits, but they haven't defined risk and acceptable returns on capital and effective tax rates. So anything about that?
Very good that we didn't
one
see
thing I could. If there's one thing I could force politicians to learn, it would be the cost of capital. Wouldn't it be wonderful to sit down that Green Party caucus and give them, the time value of money?
But think broader, right? Make the
Risk
roading
and
network
reward.
provide a return on capital back to the government, right? Require that road users cover the cost of capital of the roads.
Like, we could get them to understand about risk and reward, and how much that would help about when you're talking about things like applying your marginal tax rate to unrealized capital gain. You'd be a hell of a lot further forward in terms of debates around public policy.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Actually, I kind of object to the question. Someone asked us, do you guys have Stockholm syndrome? This is a big spending budget. When the economy is growing,
Yes.
we have an inflation problem. It's not boring.
Yes.
It's a shocker. I think we all agree.
No, but it's the new normal. If there's one message would take for you to take away, it's that we're out of COVID, but this is the new normal. Going into that, when Grant Robinson was opposition spokesperson for finance, and he basically signed up to a bunch of commitments that are now not worth the paper they're written on, but one of the TU could sign up to, and one of them was keeping government expenditure under 30% of GDP, and back then it was sort of somewhere between, floated 27-28%.
Yep.
Okay, COVID's over, and in over the projected period, out 4 years, we still 33% of GDP. That is the difference. That is the new normal. So, yep, it is a big spending budget, but all of them are. The size of fiscal envelope, the new normal is $3.5 billion.
Sure.
Bill English, what he had a series of zeros and then $500 million. I think his largest was $1 billion.
It just doesn't surprise us anymore.
Well, Robert Higgs talked about
Scandinavia, except without the good services.
Robert Higgs had talked about the ratchet effect in these sorts of things, right? So you have some crisis, government ramps up tax revenue and expenditure to deal with the crisis. After the crisis passes, well, it goes down a bit, but never to where it was before the crisis hit. And then you wait for the next crisis and it ratchets up again.
Actually, with this government, doesn't even go down.
Well, it's down on the peak.
No.
It's down on what it was in 2020.
Laurie.
Oh, look, just really underlining Jordan's point. It's easy to forget. I mean, a lot of us, I think, in Grant Robertson's first couple of years thought this is that rare bird. This is a fairly prudent left-wing finance minister. That's certainly how he looked at the time. And that did hold until COVID came to call, and then everything changed, and it hasn't changed back yet. I wanted to pick up on the point of this lack of vision in this budget too. I mean, I think it must surely be deliberately anodyne. I mean, if they were to launch the budget festooned with strap lines and slogans and fanfares and everything, the public would react to that, and they don't want the public to react to that. I think they just want to think, oh, this is a bit of do-goodery here and there. Yes, we like education. We like the thought of spending in education. Of course, we need to do $6 billion on the Gabrielle recovery. But grand ideas, grand transformational ideas. No, we don't want that. So I imagine that lack of the visionary quality is entirely deliberate. But it did surprise me when I actually watched the speech. I missed the first couple of minutes, but so I wonder if I missed some great statement of principle at the beginning of the speech, but it never turned up afterwards as well. So very curious, very interesting in an election year.
Was there anything in the budget for the development of our trade sector, excluding gaming? Your thoughts on this?
For trade.
I can't think of anything.
I didn't see anything, but I went
But in fairness, you focus at what for the first few hours, you have to focus what the politicians put in front of you, because they give you 20 odd press releases. It's not until you really get into the numbers. But no, that's what I mean. Lack of narrative.
More EV charging stations. That's surely good for Tesla. So maybe that's trade. No, it's not obvious, is it?
Next question, I think we can answer very briefly. With an upcoming election, how does the government ensure its populistic measures don't increase our debt? Well, they do increase our debt, and the populistic measures are there. I mean, did we talk about the gaming industry? I think we did. What budget policies were there to stimulate growth? And look at the Australian budget, headwinds to tailwinds with investment in growing the economy. Was there anything to stimulate growth at all?
The government would claim that some of its expenditures on gaming, but on other areas might be doing that as well. The infrastructure spend might help, but they're going to be crowding out some private sector activity with an increased debt path.
Okay. Another question here. Maybe this is a question for an accountant as well. Over the forecast period, the total assets increased by $86 billion. Liabilities increased by $67 billion. So net worth actually increases by $21 billion. Does this reduce concerns about debt, or is this an accounting trick?
Not an accounting trick, but of course, it depends what the nature of the investments are. And a lot of the investments, they're not alienable. You can't sell them. And if you've got a government that's particularly poor, I mean, that CBD rail loop in Auckland, they might as well be bearing gold underneath the Auckland CBD. But just because it's got an enormous capital valuation to it, and we're spending the earth on it, that we have to pay back that money in real money.
Eric?
Yeah, I'm not enough of an accountant to go through it. You still wonder about the risk that they are taking in borrowing to continue to invest in the super fund, when who the hell knows what's going to happen with the budget talks in the US, right? There's still a lot of risk baked into the stock market, and we're borrowing at increasingly high interest rates to play that gamble.
All right. For each of you, what is the single most important reform or investment or change that could have been made in this budget but wasn't, that you would have implemented?
Sure. First, carbon dividend. Say that there's nothing that's in it right now, but as ETS revenues rise, government will be rebating every bit of it back to households. If you do it that properly, following the Canadian example, about 90% of households get more money back from it than they ever pay in carbon taxes through the ETS. It helps to defray some of the cost of living pressures. That would also then mean that the government could let the ETS work properly. That'd be number one. Number two, inflation indexing of the tax thresholds. Announce that it will be taking effect at least from the next tax year. Can argue the toss about how much the government should make up for past wrongs. We haven't adjusted these things for well over a decade. The last time they were looked at was in the last bit of 2010. I would like it to be rolled back, but I like overall smaller government and a little bit less tax revenue. If we start from, I'm imagining I'm Grant Robertson and I still want to have a lot of money. Okay, well, maybe roll back the last 2 years of what inflation did to tax brackets and say they will be forever indexed afterwards, and challenge National to have bipartisan agreement on inflation indexing the tax thresholds. I was pretty disappointed not to see any hints around inflation indexing, really. Jordan, what would you have done?
Well, you'll expect me to. That was an excellent answer from Eric, and as a taxpayer advocate, I could probably say all of that. But it's actually all comes back to getting spending under control, because it's all very well the indexation, which would be better. I'm really worried that they're going to announce a absolutely bonkers tax-free threshold, which sounds really great, bit of money to everyone, but actually makes your marginal rate in the long term higher for everyone. It's the marginal rate that matters in terms of incentives to work and invest. In Grant Robertson's shoes, though, mindful of the political constraint he's in, and he's in a, like Cullen, he's in a cabinet where they all want to spend like drunken sailors. That's why Cullen had the Cullen Fund to park surpluses that he couldn't give back for tax relief. I'd be focusing at cutting a different sort of tax, and that would be regulatory tax relief. That the RMA, probably after MMPs, are our biggest handbrake on our long-term prosperity. These guys are making it worse. It's something we're going to be banging on about over the next few months. But David Parker's replacement to the RMA makes our biggest tax even bigger. It is never in my lifetime would I think that I would be defending the basket case of the RMA, but it is so much better than the co-governed Three Waters anti-democratic behemoth that the government isn't talking about. But it's in Parliament, it's in front of a select committee, and they've apparently committed to coming in before the election. Holy moly. That's
we
what
agree
I
with you here.
addressing.
But I think
I'll jump in again after Laurie.
Yeah. Laurie, if I made you Minister of Finance tomorrow, what would you do?
Oh, look, I agree with the answers already given, naturally enough, but I would like to see a mind shift away from spending and towards investment. You know, as I mentioned before, what is the scope of the government to invest in productive capital on the behalf of the nation without crowding out private capital? And there is scope for that. I mean, my poster child would actually probably be education. You know, if I wanted to see something transformational in this budget, it would be, you know, reversing the trend that we've observed in education and getting us back to where we need to be to ensure our future. So, yeah, less spending, more investment, and let's take the long view and really think about education and what we can do to be improving that.
Coming back on, there's one bit that I wanted to add in, because both Jordan and Laurie reminded me of it on investment and infrastructure. Like, instead of having a big pool of money that the central government's going to be using on this for whatever projects they think are going to make most sense, we need a different approach to handling all of this. Like, instead of having, here's central government pot of money and we're just going to throw it at road or rail or whatever's currently sexy, a different approach where you have project-based financing and an expectation that the revenues that come from an infrastructure project pay off the debt that was raised to support the infrastructure project in the first place. So you can do that through toll roads, put in the road, if the tolls on the road over time pay off the cost of the debt. And if the market tells you when you try and market that debt that there's no way it'll happen, don't build the road. Same thing for bridges. Give councils authority to issue the same kind of debt. You immediately unlock them from all of their balance sheet constraints because it's project-based financing. You get rid of the stupid infrastructure deficit that we've got, and you've got a mechanism for figuring out which projects make sense. That would be glorious.
Cool. I want to read out the last couple of questions, and I would like to have a quick answer from each of you. First question is there a risk that some relaxation in monetary policy now would increase inflation but would not be visible until after the election? And the second question, do you see a risk of a New Zealand credit downgrade? Eric.
I wouldn't have thought so yet. The net debt path is higher than you would have wanted, but it's not crazy. But I'm not a bond rating agency. There's always sort of risk that a less than independent central bank might be willing to goose inflation a bit to help a tied government's election prospects. But everybody's been watching the Reserve Bank closely enough now that you would hope that they would want to maintain their credibility that had been eroded over the past couple of years and to continue with the path towards getting inflation back on track.
Jordan, risk of a credit downgrade?
I'll leave this one to the economists. I don't know. My Bush economist skills do not extend to that.
Laurie.
I can't see it. I think we're moving in cohort actually with a number of peer nations overseas. So I think the risk of the downgrade is low. As to if the other question, if the Reserve Bank starts issuing a bunch more credit, will that be inflationary? Yes, of course it will eventually. Whether we would see the uptick in inflation on this side of the election, I don't know, but in the medium to long run, that has to happen.
Great. And that brings us to the end of this webinar. I think we had a very good first take on the budget. And I still have forgotten what it was called. Here today, tomorrow, something. Anyway, the no nonsense, no frills, no surprises budget, which is still high tax and high spend and based on very rosy foundations. But thank you very much, Eric, Jordan, and Laurie, for sharing your insights with us. And thank you all for attending this webinar. And we hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.